Welcome everybody again. This is IAPMR Dialogues about Building Bridges, PSM Law Theory and Practice. My name is Minna Aslama-Horowitz and I'm one of the hosts, literally the technical host of this session. I am here with Irina Grigor. And we will be taking care of that technicalities work, and that at the end we can have a Q&A session. We'll be taking care of your questions and your comments and making them for you, for our esteemed panelists. But without further ado, I give the floor to the president of IAPMR, the International Association of Public Media Researchers, Maria Michalis.
Thank you, Minna. I'm Maria Michalis. I am the co-president of the association. My colleague, Alessandro Darma, with whom I share the presidency, is unable to attend this time. He sends his apologies. A warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. This is the second webinar in our series. And we are delighted to have such an excellent panel of speakers. So to start with, Karen Donders, Director of Public Value at VRT, the Flemish public broadcaster, as well as Associate Professor at the Communication Sciences Department of the Free University of Brussels. Karen specializes not only in public service media, but in European media policy, competition policy, and the interplay between media policy and economics. She has published widely in peer-reviewed journals, is the author of several monographs, including Platform Power and Policy in Transforming Television Markets with Tom Evans in 2018, and co-editor of several books, including a Handbook of European Media Policy with Caroline Povels and Jan Luysen in 2014. And of course, the award-winning new book, Public Service Media in Europe, Law, Theory and Practice. We also have with us Anette Alen-Savikko, a university lecturer at the University of Helsinki, Faculty of Law, and an ICT law expert. She holds a Doctor of Laws with court training, as well as Bachelor of Social Science. She has published and taught, for example, in the field of media law, digital copyright, and personal data protection in particular. She has also collaborated with and written about public service media and new technologies, including artificial intelligence. She is a member of the research consortium, Communication Rights in the Age of Digital Disruption, funded by the Academy of Finland, in which a part of her work focuses on PSM. We also have Hilde van den Bulck, a professor and department head at the Drexel University in the United States, Department of Communication. She combines expertise in media structure and policies with expertise in media culture. Her work on media structures and policies focuses on the impact of technological, political, economic, and cultural processes, especially how digitization and convergence affect legacy media. She specializes, among other things, in public service media in that regard, most recently analyzing how personalization strategies based on algorithms affect the core public media value of universality. And last but not least, we are also delighted to have with us Klaus Unterberger. Since 1982, Klaus is a staff member of the Austrian Broadcasting Association, ORF, an editorial journalist in the realm of TV and information. And since 2007, he manages the Public Value Center of Expertise of the ORF. He is responsible for many actions of the ORF, quality assurance, as well as for external and internal communication. He is also active in research practitioner collaborations, including leading the creation of the Public Service Media and Public Service Internet Manifesto. And I forgot to say a very big thank you to both Minna and Marta for helping organizing this webinar. So thank you, welcome to all, and I give the floor to
Minna.
Minna. Okay.
Hello, everybody. As said, those who have just joined us in the last minutes, we will start the webinar by comments from sort of the conventional or traditional canonic perspective of public media research, policy research. We will then move on to comments on from the legal side, and then finally from the side of practice. Thereafter, my colleague Marta Rodriguez Castro, who's the young scholar and secretary of IAPMR, will interview and discuss the commentary with Karen herself. So without further ado, let us get started. Hilde, lead us into the perspective of public media research theory.
Okay, hi everybody. First of all, thank you all for having me, and thank you IAPMR and Minna and everybody for organizing this. Maybe I should start with let me put up my clock, because I think I have about 10 minutes, so I'm going to try and stick to that, right? So there we go. Okay, let me try and stick to that. But let me start with a disclaimer by saying that Karen and I go back a long time. So the author of this book that we're celebrating and I go back a long time. And I would like to say that whatever I'm going to say next is not that I like the book, because I know Karen. I know Karen because I like her work and I like how good she is. And because of that, I think her book turns out to be very good. So I think the disclaimer was in here, but I think I can be very professional when I say that I really enjoyed reading the book, that I think it deserved its price so very much. And that, you know, that I think it's good that we talk about it, because I think it's an important book. I think the starting point of that book very much captures something that I think all the researchers of public service media are kind of aware of. You know, all of our work, of almost all of us, has a very strong basis in sort of normative ideas, in theoretical ideal type thinking, right? This is very much part of thinking about public service broadcasting, public service media, and it's a long-standing tradition in the field. And we have been discussing key roles and goals of public service media, things like universality, quality, pluralism, neutrality, and how complicated this is. And this has always been affected by the reality of, obviously, of public service media, the media context in which it operates, and also wider society. So if I look back, this is something I realize how old I am, because if I look back at all the years of doing research on public service media, over the decades, really, we have discussed public service media values in a sort of post-monopoly position, with all the questions about, is it a market failure, or is it sort of complementary? Is it, do we need to think from a social responsibility? We've talked about public service, or should it be public value, to sort of, you know, new ways to capture that distinctiveness, but within a more neoliberal vocabulary, maybe. Public service broadcasting or public service media, I think Karen in her book sort of explains, and I think it's another point, I don't know if I'll get to that with an eye on the clock, but that also definitely the move from thinking about public service media to public service broadcasting to public service media has certainly happened in the heads of the researchers, maybe to some point, and I think in the practitioners, but maybe, and this is something where our colleague can comment on, maybe not so much in the minds really of governments, let alone sort of legislative frameworks, right? Maybe EU even more than national sort of legislation. We've been thinking about looking back at universality versus more personalized public service in response to things like AI and big data. At the same time, I think, so we have had a lot of these discussions of a theoretical nature. At the same time, there have been a growing number, I think, of empirical studies. And I think definitely the past 15 years have really seen public service media researchers embracing empirical work, case studies, comparative work, with sort of, you know, a growing attention to methods. People know that I go on about that stuff, right? And I think that's fantastic. We have a wonderful collection of data and analysis, and then every case study tries to sort of look back and see what does that mean for theory. I think what this book sort of stands out is really bringing all that together and also really making it communicate in two ways, right? I think that many of our case studies, and I know mine, it was that I've done, and many of our colleagues, we do our case studies and then sort of look back, where does this really link to those ideal type theories? I think what this book is really doing this at a massive scale, but also as it indicates with an idea of coming to theories and models that actually maybe have a closer relationship to the empirical reality, and in the long run, therefore, also can really contribute to the practitioner part of. And I think it's no surprise probably that Karen at this point is where she is also in her personal career, as it really reflects that combination of highly both theoretical and empirically strong, and then also that link to the reality of public service media. So I think I very much follow Karen in her argument that we need to let theory and empirical work communicate on a sort of grander, bigger scale, with an eye to developing these theories and models that better fit that reality. Obviously, for those who've already read the book, will realize that Karen brings to this her extensive knowledge of literature, her sharp analytical mind. I'm going to say all kinds of nice things about you, Karen, which I hope you'll appreciate them, because I think they're very true. You develop theoretical ideas and empirical analysis, and I think you really succeed in letting them communicate well, right? And that's so in that sense, bringing these very much together. I think Karen is outspoken also in her work and in her evaluations. I think you really look at all the facts and all the data, and you do take a stand on things. And I think that's very interesting. People don't have to agree with every standpoint that Karen has, but it makes it interesting to discuss these things. And I know that in the past, I think Karen was one of the first to sort of remind public service media scholars that, for instance, the European Union is not all bad for public service media. And I think you've been proven right probably in that regard. And you were probably very important in sort of opening many people's eyes in that regard. I have a couple of areas maybe that I want to say something about, and then hope to bring that back to the discussion for Karen to comment on, and also for other people who are present here to think about that. I think one crucially important endeavor is that in some of your case selections, you have sort of Flanders returning for obvious reasons, and you pick Poland. And I really like that fact, because a lot of our research, I think, is often based on sort of the most ideal types of what we think public service media would be, also in our cases. And you, as you say in your book, we always tend to look back at the BBC, which maybe isn't even all that ideal, but which has the aura at least of that, but it's really not so very representative of what is going on in most of the countries. But then I think a fact that you sort of really sort of put the Polish case to the fore is also interesting, in the sense that we need to get over the idea that Poland maybe is an oddity in that wider field, but really brings to the attention how diverse public service media are in the way they function, in the way they are contextualized. And I think that's to me, that's a very crucial thing of the book, because, and I think I've been guilty of that too, even if you look at new developments, we'll look at the ones that are the furthest advanced in using AI or whatever, and I look at the rest and go like, they're not that far ahead yet or whatever. Well, maybe it's those ones that are the most advanced, or maybe not always the most, the most interesting cases to look at, right? Because we need to look at the whole diversity, and I think the book does that very well. I think the Polish case also points attention to something that I find very sort of interesting, and that has come back to light. And this is also a question maybe, or a point of attention, which goes back to the sort of political capture, right? Poland is a sort of idea of often, and is also an example of how, politics has sort of made its way into public service media, maybe more than ever. But this is also my comment, and I do think that in the book it's discussed well, but maybe more as a discussion point for the larger group here, is that if you look back at the history of public service media, politicization was for a very long time very much part of it, right? And I think Burgelman, one of Karen's predecessors in Brussels, did a PhD on the politicization within public service media. And we've, to some extent, probably in many countries, felt that sort of the influence of new public management sort of helped to get rid of that. But maybe we never really got rid of that as much as, scholars would have liked to believe. And so I wonder if it makes sense that if we try and understand current examples of sort of political capture or sort of, you know, to go back and look at those older established or acknowledged forms of politicization and how they relate to one another, because sometimes even maybe they have always continued in a slightly different way. If you look again, and I'm sort of referencing Karen, but also I know from my own research that in the Flemish case, the board of directors has always remained a pretty political institute, and even there's examples in the early 2000s where a media minister would pick up the phone and call the public broadcaster and say there's not enough Flemish music on the radio, right? So maybe it's never been that far away, and maybe more than anything this Polish case is a reminder of that we need to pay attention to that and never assume that the Polish case is just that sad, you know, example of how politics is really deeply involved, but remain attentive to it in various ways. And I think Minna and you and your colleague have really been looking at criteria to sort of discuss that capture, the political capture. And I think it's important work that we apply to sort of in various ways to all the different ones. I think another aspect of the book, and now I'm sort of running from one to the other and probably also running out of time. I think I like that the book develops a theoretical framework that really goes back to the really early historical roots, and Karen sort of goes back to modernity and even the Enlightenment ideals that have really been very much part of that early thinking about public service media. And I think in a way this is more a more radical choice than some might think, particularly in an era where almost all of these aspects have been questioned, ignored, even rejected, right? And I think it is interesting because I feel that, you know, if again, maybe it's because I'm old, maybe it's because I did a historical PhD, but if you think about how we used to complain about public service broadcasting being patronizing and paternalistic and things like that, right? That has been a sort of way of saying they need to be closer to the audience, and I think we all agree on all of that. At the same time, if we then look, for instance, at the whole discussion about algorithms and AI, we will say we think they need to do more. We almost literally say, I think, when we talk about algorithms that should be developed for public service media, we almost literally say they should help the audience give what we think they need, not what they want, which is a very old one, but is a returning. So I think it's kind of interesting that we dare to confront that. Do we think, and we no longer want it to be patronizing, paternalistic, but do we really, let's face it, do we think that public service media, while paying attention, more attention and better attention to the audience than they've done so far, do we actually still think that there is a reason to say we might, you know, that old thing that we've all been trying to reject and be critical of? So I appreciate this. That's almost a radical point of view. And my third thing is maybe also a little, well, not radical, but it's different. I think it's to do with public service media, and I've often defended public service media also when they were criticized for all kinds of things. We've always looked at them as being mainstream media, right? They need to do more and whatever, but they're mainstream media. The question is, what are mainstream media today? Is Facebook and all its fake news, we shouldn't use the term fake news, all its dis and misinformation, let me use the proper terms, right? Are those today the mainstream media? Is our newspapers that have as much sort of commercially paid content as actual news, are those the mainstream media? If those are the mainstream media, then maybe public service media should not be mainstream anymore, and maybe they should be alternative media. And maybe we should think of them in that respect, which means that we're also not looking at them as a market failure, because then you're still talking about them within that commercial neoliberal perspective. But maybe we need to let go of that and maybe just radically rethink in that sense. Maybe we've come to a point where they are the alternative media that reach a bigger audience than anything else. Maybe alternative media is not defined by the number of audiences it can reach. Public service media have a commitment, and they should, because they're paid by everybody. So they should reach everybody. But in thinking about what they should do, maybe we've come to a point where they can and should be the alternative media. And I'll shut up there. But congratulations, Karen.
Thank you, Hilde, so much for your provocative, I would say even a radical commentary. You are redefining alternative media for us. You made me think of something. We had another conference last week, and we had a roundtable where a representative of the Finnish broadcasting company said, hey, where is the epistemological backbone of Finland? Can we be the epistemological backbone? So this radical choice and pointing out to Karen's point of view, I think goes nicely with that metaphor. But without further ado, how can we look at all of this from the framework of legal studies and law? Anette, Alen-Savikko, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Minna. Do you hear me? Great. So first of all, thank you for this opportunity, and to Karen for this book. It was a pleasure to read. As a first point I would like to make is that when talking about law, I offer here the perspective of a media legal scholar or media academic lawyer, however you want to put it. So instead of a legal counsel or a judge, for instance. I have listed some highlights from the perspective of law understood in this way. And the first thing that kind of follows what I just said is that legalism or strict view on law is not enough here. Karen also talks about regulation and governance, even to the from within public service broadcasters and media themselves. Even if then we need to see that legalism or law understood in a strict way or stricter way is very important in legal fora. But in this book, of course, the view is also wider. And what I saw as the important trends here is that on one hand, the national /EU level competencies with regard to be it the markets, the internal markets, culture, public service, democracy, rule of law, all these things have also specific competencies and areas that can be done at national and at EU level. And they play a pretty big role here in terms of the challenges also. And then what I realized is that this type of legal regulatory safeguards and frameworks are important, especially with regard to independence, be it from markets, states, I mean, political, economic forces or dimensions, and then also with regard to accountability when it comes to public interest and citizens. So they are really important in this regard. For instance, constitutional free speech, editorial independence, inclusion of citizens, things like this. And finally, as an overall trend, I identified the need for evidence-based, for research-based decision-making and policy. For instance, when it comes to the market effects of public service broadcasters or public service media, what are the market effects, including in the online environment? The public value test, which should be evidence-based, that it actually would be that. And also regarding markets in the internationalized and converged media landscape, including platformization. And of course, it could be difficult at this point, but always when it is possible, you should resort to evidence-based decision-making, as I read from Karen's book. And then when we come to the conceptual rethinking with regard to like the transition from public service broadcasters to public service media at various stages, but in a non-linear manner, as Karen puts it, and taking into account all these internationalization, converge, or digitalization, all the social rupture elements. So the existing frameworks as they stand, we can all, of course, look at them, existing legal and regulatory frameworks. And like Karen says, they are in need of an update with regard to all these trends and elements that are happening. And with regard to the transition to and then performance of public service media. But in the end, the book also presents the idea of silences and absences. And I read the book and I already started to map my own picture in a way. And in the end, the book and I found these absent law or absent legal frameworks. And there is this notion of also invisible power or notion of alternatives or other values and rival interests and stuff like that being marginalized and delegitimized or ignored. But what I was, from the legal perspective, thinking also was the power already, which Hilde actually already brought into the picture, the power already involved in what is considered or defined as alternative, other, marginal, and then probably delegitimized and stuff like that. So already the definitions in what is an alternative, what is the other, and so on. So in terms of law, rule, and exception, what is the rule, what is the exception? And also we come to the finally, in talking about all this legal stuff and evidence-based decision making, we of course have to admit that we come back to choices and decisions also at the societal level, and the justifications for existence of public service media beyond technological or whatever, be it objective or technical justifications. We come to the questions of politics, policy, what kind of society we want to live in, who can fulfill the functions, and how in that kind of society that we want to live in. So what I would like to do, if it functions now, is to show one slide. So I will try to share my screen. Does it show? Can you see white?
Yes, white.
Yes. So if we look at the rule and exception concept, as I said, of course, it is different if we look at the issue in this way. And of course, we have to bear in mind all these, what I was saying in the beginning about these competencies at EU level, at national level and stuff like that. It is pretty different if we see it this way, that what is the rule, what is the exception? And if we also take into account what Karen writes about citizenship as then a concept that might actually offer a conceptual kind of a navigation tool in the midst of a market failure and the democracy centric perspective to public service media. So this fits in, I think, in my picture also. And here, of course, all this becomes very difficult in terms of the national, EU, even global perspectives we have to take into account. But I also see that we need to take a very radical rethinking also when it comes to these rules and the law and what is the rule, what is the exception perspective with regard to all these social ruptures and polarization and internationalization and convergence. But then I was wondering how actually to do it, how to translate all this into law, because it is of course difficult just to get on how it is, because the nation state has its like strengths, but then of course we talk about platformization and all this kind of stuff. So we need something beyond the national level, and then we need even something beyond EU level, but the EU level as such cannot, if we talk about normative ideals in this book's frameworks, the EU level cannot be restricted to being this. We have to have it like this. And then would this mean, for instance, looking at this from the perspective of fundamental and human rights, and even so that this wider green would affect how we interpret the little green area? So that would be one possibility. And then even some new rights could be needed. And of course, we could even say that this necessitates more strict enforcement in this area or something like that. So this can be translated into law, but of course, this requires more research, and there is some research, of course, already in this regards. For instance, on the communication rights and the human rights and fundamental rights. But that was all that I have to say at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Anette. Thank you for visualizing it for us. It was, at least for me, very, very useful. And also, thank you for bringing it to the issue of rights, communication rights, human rights. There are already a couple of questions that can sort of be related to that as well. And I believe it was already about 10 years ago when Article 19, an NGO based in the UK, but I believe in global NGO that cares for freedom of expression, as you can imagine from the name, Article 19, they wrote up a policy proposal for the Council of Europe, thinking PSB through human rights specifically and framing it entirely in that content, away from the market failure paradigm. So very interesting, and thank you, Anette, also for bringing that up. Now, as Maria Michalis already said, last but absolutely not least, it's a pleasure to hear from a practitioner's point of view, and especially from a practitioner who has been so fundamentally involved also in collaborating with researchers and rethinking the future of PSM. So Klaus Unterberger from the Austrian public broadcaster ORF, the floor is yours. And you need to unmute.
I'm just about 200 years in communication, so I couldn't find the appropriate tool. Okay, so hello to all of you. Now you can hear me, I can hear you. So thank you very much for inviting me and for your kind words, Minna. I appreciate that. But let me first of all welcome Karen Donders, late but not too late, in the community of public value at the inside world of public service media, in appreciation of your scientific work. And I think I've got the ultimate proof in my hand, which is some sort of personal and very successful public value test, I suppose, isn't it? So I think you will be a major support in our community, identifying core values, goals, and strategic perspectives and documenting and evaluating performance of public service quality, and last not least, to do some advocacy in communicating to our stakeholders, to the audiences, and to the public for sure. So this is interdisciplinary, and this is the reason we needed you, Karen. Now we've got you. I'm delighted. So welcome on board. Personally, I have to say, and some of you might know me already, I'm a hybrid identity, so to say. I'm a journalist with an academic background. So today I try to contribute a little bit of a grassroots reality check in the context of your book, and I will apply some reality check questions, so to say. And I'm going to start with the first one related to your concept of public service media as a citizenship and democracy-centric project, according to the 4 dimensions of the political, the social, the cultural, and the civil citizenship. Frankly speaking, I have to say, according to the European Song Contest, you introduced by picking the title Building Bridges, you might remember. I might say I'm going to give 12 points to Karen from Austria. So I very much appreciate your concept, not just because it refers to Jürgen Habermas' perception of the public sphere, but because it highlights the distinctiveness of public service media addressing citizens and not just consumers. And that was a cornerstone in my own work when I started many years ago, because this is, I think, a very crucial question we always have to pose, and this is still very much important. If you look at the internet, public communication in digital media is almost dominated by private companies, private ownership, and commercial interest. We all are aware of the severe impacts. I don't have to go into detailed explanations. And this is why it is from utmost importance for democracy to revive citizenship in many ways. And public service media is certainly one of it. However, I promised to do some reality checking. So I've got 3 questions. Maybe they can stimulate some debate. First of all, when focusing on citizenship, Karen, what will we do with popular programs like entertainment and sports? And frankly speaking, you know, everybody knows that these kind of programs are often just about love, fun, and drama. Yeah, and not that much about citizenship. Even if I'm very keen on uploading entertainment and these program formats with societal backgrounds, yeah, that is considered to be public service media quality, I know that most of the programs are simply entertainment or simply drama. So how can we actually include this kind of programs into your very, very useful concept? But I think that's crucial because we all know we have to reach broad audiences, a broad segment of society. And if we don't do that, then we can't fulfill our mission. And frankly speaking, I think some of our distinguished members in our communities have already reached that border, even going beyond of being relevant for society. And if you just look at the data of media perception, I'm always stating Mark Eisenecker from Switzerland, and he came up with data that the biggest media user segment in Switzerland, and I think that's very close to our society as well, is already those who are no longer connected to quality media and to journalistic media. Yeah, and I think that's very alarmingly, because we are losing out on democracy, and there we are at the brink of democracy if people are no longer connected to journalistic and proven, competent, serious information. So my question would be, how can we integrate that segment from a very practical point of view? Question number 2 that popped up when reading your book is also a little bit obvious, unfortunately, I have to say, because citizens are not always the good guys. Yeah, if you just look at the angry populist crowd shouting out loud on the street, or just look at Hungary, there you have a qualified majority of Orban voters. And this is also, isn't that about citizenship as well? So I think it's a little bit a challenge to cope with that. I don't know how you would react on that. but there's an obvious challenge in this spectrum as well. And the third question would be about the evaluation. The complexity of the definitions is sometimes, in my experience, a little bit of a trap. Let's say the beauty of the creation of defining public service media will necessarily be confronted by reality, which means the better you perform in definition, the more you may lose out in evaluation, yeah, as there will be no sufficient proof of evidence. And if this is the case, we are in trouble. So therefore, I see, and I saw in the last 20 years, that we have already an overload of expectations and obligations for public service media. Yeah. At the same time, public service media globally is a shrinking community. You know, you just look at the numbers, just look at the resources. I had it all in the last 40 years. We've got the business managers of CEOs, we've got controllers everywhere with one cost-cutting program after the other. We've got regulators, politicians, supervising boards, political correctness as guidance, and tons of obligation. So some of this is already suffocating us. So I know this is a dilemma, and I'm not questioning your concept. I don't at all, because I see that you will deliver very useful arguments for the existence for public service media. However, I think there is a challenge, and I don't expect any answer from you now, because this will keep you busy until your retirement. Yeah, which is a long way to go. So I don't have just 2 minutes. I wanted to do something about independence, but to cut it short, I absolutely agree to your analysis. I think your analysis of the situation in Poland is alarmingly correct. And I also agree that EBU, European Broadcasting Union, has to stand firm. Yeah, we have to act up here. We can't sit and wait, and this is what we actually do in order to define minimum requirements, how we can protect our community towards misbehaving members, how we act up in these very crucial questions of yours. However, I just have to add that you should know, and all we know, is there's a very effective way to protect independency quite effectively. Editorial guidelines and most relevant rights for journalists. So if you have a reality check on this one, if you want independent journalists, you simply have to give them rights to protect themselves. So in the last mention and remark I wanted to do is about public broadcasters moving online, multi-platform strategies. And to make it short, I think there are very good news at the moment, and Mina already mentioned that. We did this kind of manifesto recently, and I think this is a wonderful bridge between the community of the scientists and the communities of journalists. And as we have already achieved 1,000 scientists have supported that, I think we really should go public, to include also journalists and practitioners, as you say, because we cannot allow to stand by. So I think I reached the limit, my time limit, but congratulations for your book. It is very helpful in a practical way. It is, to my understanding, a contribution for being a driver of change. And this is the most crucial aspect in my work. I don't want to sit and lean back and just to protect public service media, but I'm fully aware that public service media has to change in order to become a relevant contributor in a democratic public sphere. So congratulations, Karen. And I hope that we meet someday in Vienna. Yeah, I'm gonna invite you.
Thank you so much, Klaus. You brought yet another layer to our conversation, and you asked some tough questions, which I guess are not only to Karen, but to all of us for the discussion and Q&A session. So please take a look at them in chat, everybody. But now Karen, you embody the title of our webinar, as Klaus already pointed out. You are building bridges between theory, a lot of empirical research, and now being an insider at PSM World, a practitioner with all this knowledge. Marta, the floor is yours. Karen, the floor is yours. How are your responses to these comments?
Okay, do I wait for Marta, or can I briefly
No.
already comment on?
I think it's better if you answer all the questions posed by our wonderful commentators, and then I will take the discussion a bit further.
Okay, thank you, Marta. And thank you very much, Hilde, Anette, and Klaus, for reading the book so carefully, because it's actually, it's not really a page turner, and it's quite, it's quite big. So I do appreciate that. And obviously also the compliments. Also many thanks for those that are joining the webinar, and to Mina and Marta for the excellent organization. I took some notes, so I will also try to keep my response short, although that's not my strongest point, as a lot of people in the group know. So Marta, you keep me on my toes if I overdo it. Hilde, at some point you raised a comment that I perhaps would like to respond to about the model being quite radical, in the sense, you said it more nicely, but I will summarize it less nicely, that it's actually quite old-fashioned, because it's going back to modernity and enlightenment, and to some extent you. Yeah, I also, at the end of writing the book, but then it was finished and I didn't want to change it anymore. You can actually question the whole premise on which the book rests, and that is that public service media, yes, to some extent should be paternalistic, but I think without people feeling it or experiencing it as such. And to some extent that also relates to one of the comments that Klaus made on entertainment and on sports. And yeah, well, to some extent, I think that content can also be very societally valuable, but it also helps in kind of, yeah, in making sure that public service media is citizen oriented, but in the way that the service delivery is working, consumer centric. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that is, I think, the balancing act already since the public broadcasters came into being. And you have this paper of Graham Murdoch, Digital Commons, in which he actually describes public broadcasting as a policy project that embodies kind of this ladder that people should climb, and this really emancipation idea. And although that sounds very old-fashioned, I'm really a fan of that, and it's also one of the things that I'm trying to do within VRT these days. Again, in a way that works, in a way that's not boring, that is not like condescending, looking down on the audience, but it does try to take up the role of public broadcasters in strengthening society. And in that sense, Hilde, I also kind of like the idea of positioning public broadcasting not as mainstream media, because the argument would be that mainstream media are actually profit driven, whereas public broadcasters, although some of them also collect commercial money, the public broadcaster I'm working for also does that in quite significant ways, but that money or that profit is not driving what we are doing. So in that sense, you could argue we're not like mainstream, but alternative, or a better concept that we might be looking for. So that were 2 points I wanted to raise regarding Hilde's comments. Anette also made a lot of interesting remarks, I think, because it's obviously true that the book does not contain, I would argue, pure legalistic analyses, and that was also obviously not the aim of the book. I have to say, I also liked the visualization very much that you made, because indeed, if you see public service media as a project that fits within democracy and the rule of law, it becomes less of an exception, it becomes the rule. Whereas if you position it in this kind of culture versus market failure story, then you immediately put public broadcasting more in the margin. So that is actually what I liked when this big circle popped up on the screen. I felt like a bit of relief even within myself, because you immediately notice from this very simple visual, actually, you immediately notice that the position of public broadcasting will be much more comfortable if you add the democracy and rule of law to the equation. You also said something, well, you said a lot of things, but I just will pick two things with everyone to also keep an eye on timing, about evidence-based policies. And I think that that was one of the main findings of the book, and I have to say a big disappointment for me as a scientist, and I trust also for a lot of you, is that evidence-based policy, in my not so modest opinion, is an illusion. And I think also Hilde already said we go back a long way. We also have published stuff together on, for example, public value tests and to what extent they rely on evidence. And you do see a lot of input, but then suddenly all that input goes into a black box, and then something comes out of which you don't know if it relates to evidence, and of which our research actually suggests it does not really relate to the evidence. And in a way, it's also, I would argue, a mission impossible, in the sense that you try to compare apples and oranges, and because it might be that a certain service of a public broadcaster based on evidence has a negative market impact, although I have to say I rarely come across research that points that out, but for the sake of argument, assume that we might find that. But we also see a big impact on, positive impact on democracy, on all these aspects of citizenship. Then I would of course argue that the latter is more important, whereas a commercial media CEO, and you cannot blame him, usually him, you cannot blame him for that, would obviously argue the opposite. So that is kind of a mission impossible, of which policymakers at some point also thought, hey, this is, you know, the chicken with the golden egg, is the public value test, and it's and we've seen that it's not working, and that is, I think, people that have read the book or will read the book will see evidence-based policies, not such a big believer in that anymore. And then Klaus, I will definitely come to Vienna when you invite me. So I will take you up on that. You also talked about entertainment and sports, and I agree that some public broadcasters engage in entertainment and sports of which you think, is this really public value? I can honestly say that I think that the public broadcaster I work for is, for example, very good in sports broadcasting. It's internationally renowned for that. We had to let go of some sports rights because government also wants us to, you know, give some oxygen to the market in that regard, and we do that. Our competitors also do wonderful things, but when they do sports, the free-to-air ones, we usually on Twitter see a lot of criticism and people actually saying, why is this not on my public broadcaster? Because the sport journalism, it's more than sports coverage, it's sports journalism. It's underpinned by years and years of expertise, of knowledge accumulation and things like that, not only content-wise, but also in the technical, the capturing of the event. And also for entertainment, I think it's possible not to go in, let's say, the very cheap entertainment that is very easily interchangeable with commercial broadcasters. So I also think that entertainment and sports are necessary, but I also think they can have a lot of value. I agree with you that that is not the case with each and every broadcaster. And I would even admit that also with VRT, sometimes you also miss the ball, you know? And I think you need to be able to admit that when you drop the ball. It is a business of humans doing stuff, and they make mistakes or they get carried away by, we don't have to be, I think, hypocritical about that. every morning I get the figures of how many people we reach the evening before that. It's important that we reach people to have impact, and sometimes some people get carried away a bit too much with the numbers. So I think we also, as public broadcasters, need to admit that we are flawed. That's essentially the case. I also wanted to relate that to what you said, that expectations are too high compared with the budgetary context. I can, of course, only confirm that in the sense that also VRT has been cutting costs already since 2007. And also in the new management contract, we again need to cut quite a lot of money, which actually means that compared to 2007, in real economic terms, we have a budget that is 25% less than it was in 2007. While we actually do more. I think this is the story of a lot of public broadcasters, although the figures can obviously differ a bit. But at the same time, my opinion is that expectations cannot be too high. And I will explain why. Because I do think that public broadcasters are institutions, at least in some countries. There are few institutions that people expect so much from. I mean, with the train, Belgian people expect it to be late. It's annoying, but we expect it to be late. Whereas with the public broadcaster, we have the expectation that it is trustworthy, that it delivers good information, good sports, good entertainment program, high quality drama, that we win prizes, that we do stuff for children, that we have a first screen app, which we don't have at the moment for our player. And they all expect that. So the more complaints I get, the happier at some point I am. This might sound really strange, but it shows how important people actually find a public broadcaster. I always tell my CEO, the day that I don't get any parliamentary question anymore on the public broadcaster, that is the day that I get worried, because it's the day that we will have become completely irrelevant. But I do get the more practical implication of the question. And perhaps the question about the angry populist people, we can leave that to the audience. But it's indeed a difficult one to navigate. I personally don't think only the people, let's say, on the extreme right. But I also, although I hate the word woke, I think it's a terrible concept. I don't like it. I think that a lot of people are put away and put aside as woke, whereas they actually raise very real issues. But what I do notice more than when I was an academic, when I'm in the inside of the public broadcaster, every single sentence can actually frustrate certain groups in society. And at some point, you also need to have the freedom to let creativity play. That doesn't mean that if we're really discriminating, hurtful, whatever, that should be allowed. But you also notice that the people that make the program at some point get like, you know, you don't dare to move anymore. And that is also something that I think we should be very careful about. Okay, Marta, I think I used 15 minutes. That's still acceptable, I think.
Perfect timing. You have like 30 seconds left, so that's wonderful. I have also some questions about this wonderful book. I had quite a lot of questions, but some of them were already dealt with. So I think I will stick with 3 of them. And I'd like to start by asking you about one of the ideas in your book that I found more shocking and at the same time accurate when I read it. And you say, and I quote, that public service media theory is more about what we want it to be than about what it is. That has obvious value, but more work also outside the field of news and current affairs is needed on how public broadcasters manage or fail to contribute to political, cultural, social, and civic citizenship. So in this regard, what do you think is the value that lies behind this idealistic public service media theory that we as scholars are developing? Does it make sense that we are researching from this idealistic point of view? Is there any value behind it, or are we missing the point?
No, I still think it's valuable because I also did it to think about the ideal. I actually also think, and I don't know what Klaus thinks about that, but I actually think that there also is an impact of this, let's say, theoretical idea on what public broadcasters actually try to aspire. And we, for example, we in the academic community then, I still wearing these two hats. A lot of public broadcasters are still struggling with this transition from public broadcasting to public service media, whereas we already for some years now are discussing about public service platforms and these kind of things. And you see that this is now being picked up also in the community of the public broadcasters, actually. So there is definitely an impact of this. What should be the ultimate goal of public broadcasting? So in that sense, I think it's highly valuable to do it. But when we then confront the ideal with the reality, we have the inclination to blame everyone but the public broadcaster for the fact that the ideal is not being realized. It's the audience that doesn't get it. It's the government that don't give that do not give enough money, which they don't in a lot of countries, which is true. It is the government that is jeopardizing the independence. And I think it's much more complex than that. And a public broadcaster is also not like a homogeneous kind of entity that is a kind of passive victim of government policies or a passive victim of audiences that do not get how valuable they actually are. And that is also one of the things I think that is missing in public service media theory, is actually the role of public broadcasters themselves. It's sometimes a very missing element in what we do. So the ideal definitely still important, but we need to incorporate at some point the institution also in there.
And also following up with this ideal, you mentioned in your book, and Hilde mentioned it in her comment as well, the BBC is usually the ideal public service broadcaster. Do you think we will ever be able to overcome this overuse of BBC as the ideal public service broadcaster? What can we do about it as researchers? Where should we look into to find alternative ideals?
Yeah. For sake of clarity, because people that read the book might get the impression I have something against the BBC, which of course I don't. I think they also have very valuable outputs. I also think, like all public broadcasters, they also have their mistakes, which is sometimes something we are blind for. And yes, I think as an academic community, we can overcome this. And we're actually already in the process of overcoming it. One of the answers obviously is the fact, and I also see that in the group of people present in this webinar, it's a lot of non-UK people. And again, wonderful that UK scholars do research about UK public broadcasting. But I think at conferences, we already see this. We're not only talking anymore about the UK and, oh, what are the others doing? The others are taking more central stage in conferences. I also think, secondly, don't always invite keynote speakers from the BBC and the UK. Of course, can be valuable, but also try to get in these other perspectives. So I think we're already making this turn. Again, that doesn't mean that it's not relevant, but I repeat what I have said in the book. The UK is one of the biggest audiovisual markets in Europe and actually in the world. It's extremely export oriented. A lot of the revenues come from export. If you look at any other European market, you will not find comparable figures. It has a public service media system with the BBC and supposedly other public channels such as Channel 4 and ITV, which is also something that is quite alien to other public broadcasters. The political system is a political system that is, of course, very different to the US political system, but it also has this kind of, almost dual party system, which is again something that in a lot of European countries we don't know. So there's so much structural issues that make that I sometimes felt like a bit disheartened when I, for example, in Poland, and then people started talking about the BBC, and I thought, but this is, this will not lead you anywhere. They should also not compare themselves to Flanders. It's just so different. So these people are looking at, the BBC is our leading example, but you're like in I cannot use the word, but you're in Warsaw, you're in Poland. It ain't gonna happen like that. And that was mainly the point I wanted that I wanted to make. I perhaps overdid it a bit, but it has the advantage of being clear in these things. And I also sometimes think, like, for example, a couple of months ago, because within VRT, I'm also responsible for diversity and inclusion policies. And a couple of months ago, someone that works on that issue for me sent me an email. The BBC published a new diversity action plan, and it freed up over £100 million on an annual basis to work on diversity and inclusion. And then you think, okay, let's all fly there and listen to what they are doing, but it will not help me because I don't have £100 million to work on diversity and inclusion. And at the same time, I have to do it. I don't even dare to say in this group how much money I have to work on diversity and inclusion, because it's really peanuts. And I also honestly don't believe that it's money that will drive the change in that very, very important area of diversity and inclusion. It's a matter of more diverse people on the working floor and of a changing mindset, which sounds more simple than it is to realize in an organization. And that is actually what I meant with it. Let's also look at other practices that might be more helpful to specific countries in Europe.
I'd like to have to ask our commentators, to Hilde, Anette, and Klaus, if you have any insights on this that you want to comment, any opinions regarding this idealistic theory that we built from the academia, or about the use of the BBC as a model, but also about this this issue that Karen mentioned about putting the blame on different agents, but never on the public service media organizations. If you want to say something, you are very invited to do so.
Maybe about the BBC thing, because I think we all look at them and there's so many interesting things coming out of that. There's also, on the other hand, I mean, I think it's just very healthy. And I do think, as Karen says, that it has been happening, is that we just look at, you know, and there's so many scholars now from all over studying various cases of various public service broadcasters. I think still we would invite more people. I know some of them are probably in the audience, to get sort of, you know, and to engage with people from outside of Europe, right? Because we're still very much sort of looking at Europe, but even there is so much. And I think we all want to know what's happening at the BBC, but as much, I would say, as we want to know what's happening in the German, in the Dutch, in the Flemish, whatever, and the Austrian, and come and find best practices, and maybe, you know, and look there and then see, put them next to each other and see. And I think that is definitely the way forward. And I do think that is happening. I don't know so much at the level of the practitioners. I don't really know. It could be interesting to see at the EBU how big a voice the various broadcasters have there in sort of pushing their agendas. But I think if we can sort of keep our focus on what the data tell us from various case studies and bring them together, rather than just, then I think we will find so many interesting practices and good practices that it's going to solve itself in that regard, I think.
Any other feedback on this? If not, I'll move on. So my second question, I will use
Klaus
another.
had a comment. Klaus had a comment. Hand up.
Klaus, please.
Yeah, just one little comment on Hilde. I think you're perfectly right. I mean, I wonder why the European Broadcasting Union can come up with such a successful tool like the European Song Contest, but we haven't invented the European Citizenship Award, for example. Yeah, we could do that. I mean, this is not about an ivory tower of democracy, but this is just about empowerment of people. And that is the real comment I wanted to do, because I'm always eager to be a little bit future oriented, because as a practitioner, I have to move on and I have to keep things going and not just debating. So I think the crucial word in public media is public. Yeah, that's the asset. The public is the asset. People matter. And this is exactly what Facebook made famous and successful, because they know 2 people are a couple. Yeah, 100 are maybe a crowd, but 1,000 are society. And this is a huge chance for public service media in the digital environment, because there's literally speaking an empty space in the midst of our society, which is the European public sphere. And frankly speaking, this does not exist. We don't have it. You know, we are connected to each other right now, but there's no such place as a civic public space in Europe. So I think who else then public service media should create it in many ways. But doing so, public service media has to learn to fill in this space. And we haven't learned that yet, frankly speaking. So maybe we will be curators in the future. Maybe we will have a completely different mindset in order to cooperate with institutions, with other quality medias, yeah, with young audiences. Yeah, I'm not just speaking about user-generated content. I'm very skeptical about that, because I insist on professional skills in journalism. Yeah, so I think there are severe traps on that concept too. But nevertheless, I think we can be very, very, very successful if we pick up the dimension of the European public sphere and keep going. Yeah, but we have to do some initiatives. And Karen, I can feel your pain, yeah, not having resources, yeah, and you're completely right. But on the other hand, you know, many ideas don't cost that much, so we have to actually act up. And you know, as you're coming from VRT right now, I'm recommending to all of my guys, your guys from VRT, yeah, in many ways, yeah. I'm still recommending my colleagues from Yle, yeah, because they are front runner in many ways. So I think the European and international concept of public service media is completely underrated at the moment, and I think we have to open that space. I said that to my distinguished colleague from Germany last time. I said we are, you know, just playing soccer in our national league, but we are ignoring Champions League. we have to do the Champions League, and so therefore, if we're gonna do that, we will have a lot of support, a lot of attention, and I think a lot of success.
Thank you, Klaus, for your feedback as well. Sally Ann Wilson from the Public Media Alliance is also bringing this up in the chat. She explains that working with worldwide public service media institutions, she says that some of the neatest and most effective ideas and innovations are not money-led and are often from smaller underfunded public media organizations. So that's something that we should also bear in mind. Thank you, Sally, for that insights as well. Following with something that Klaus was also mentioning now, I'd like to pose a question about cooperation and about how, Karen, you challenge the idea about public service media is provided by public service broadcasters, but that might not be the ideal for the future. Maybe the provision of public service media may change. You actually say that, and I quote, that public broadcasters are not the center of the universe, and while there is a definite commercialization of the private media scene, they are not the only ones pursuing objectives that go beyond sales and profit. So how do you picture an ideal scenario where maybe public service media is provided not only by public service broadcasters, but also by other media providers? Could that work?
I think that more providers than public broadcasters can provide media in the public interest. That I definitely do. But that does not take away that public broadcasters and also some community media, some alternative media are the only organizations that actually do that structurally. And that is a very important distinction. But I just wanted to make that argument because I do feel that besides public broadcasters, all providers of media have some sort of social responsibility. And with that, I do not only mean commercial broadcasters, I do not only mean cable operators, I'm also talking about the Spotifys, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Siris, the Alexas of this world. If you, as a Belgian Flemish media consumer, turn on Siri or Alexa and you ask to listen to Dutch-speaking music, you don't get a radio channel of VRT, whereas we have radio channels that specifically offer Dutch-speaking music. You get Spotify as a first option. That I think is a problem. And that is actually what I wanted to say. I think that all of these providers, and of some of them already do it, others do not, have a responsibility. I mean, we're not in the business of making cookies. We're in the business of making media. And with that, I mean that all companies have a responsibility to act in that way, and not only to act in a way of we want profits. And an area where I think that's very visibly is in the area of native content, native advertising, branded content. Well, people are not talking about native advertising anymore. People are in the industry now talking more about branded content. It's exactly the same, but branded content sounds better than native advertising. But it's exactly the same. And I challenge you to go to websites of newspapers, broad newspapers. They have content on housing, on energy, on all of these topics that are completely branded content, and the consumer cannot see it. It's completely unclear for the consumer. And I think it's the responsibility of the company. One, I don't believe in branded content. I think should be much less of it, only in exceptional circumstances. But if you do it, you need to be clear to the consumer that you're doing it, that you're addressing the consumer purely in his consumer characteristic and not at all in the citizenship aspects, actually. So yes, I do think that all companies need to provide media in the public interest, simply because public broadcasters do not reach everyone. So everybody has a responsibility. I think that some companies are also taking that responsibility to some extent. I think most are not taking that responsibility structurally. That is a bit the, one side and the other side answer to that. But I do think it's responsible. We're not in the business of making clothes, of making cookies. We are in a business that is actually core to our democracy. And I do feel that sometimes we lose that out of sight, also in the kind of deregulatory spirit that we see at the European, but also at the national level. And there is also very often this remark of policymakers, it's impossible to regulate, so we should let it go, this platform world, we cannot regulate it. And I completely disagree with that. We elect politicians to actually do that. If they say they cannot do it, then we shouldn't elect politicians anymore. I mean, it's really awkward that politicians say, no, we cannot do our job, it's impossible. I said that with Tom Evans in our book on platform policies, and that our responses there are too weak. And this is not a conceptual academic discussion. I mean, we discuss it in academia. It's a real life problem. When I talk about Siri and Alexa discriminating us, it's a problem for public broadcasting. When on our remote control of Samsung or other hardware manufacturers, there is a fast button to YouTube and to Netflix, but not to the public broadcaster, we have a problem, because I'm sure that but also Klaus, we cannot pay Samsung for a fast button on its remote control. We cannot do it. This is not innocent, because the first thing that people will do is push the Netflix button. And that is the issue that I want to raise. I think we should not be blind for the fact that public broadcasters do not have a monopoly on public service. Also, other companies can provide media in the public interest. 2, I don't think that they do this structurally. And 3, I think that policymakers are not sufficiently adequately taking their responsibility in ensuring that they do. Yeah.
Thank you, Karen. If our commentators want to add something, and I'd like to apologize to Anette because I didn't see the hand that she raised before. So if you want to add now something related to the previous issue, you can do as well.
Yes, thank you. It was just about Hilde's previous notes on the radical like rethinking, and then on the other hand old school stuff, and then what Klaus talked about the public and rethinking public sphere and so on. So I just also, like I said in my presentation, I also understood it as a call to this type of radical rethinking in many areas, and also the basics have to be rethought, and that means that we have to know the history and know the old school stuff, and in order to be able to rethink. And then of course with regard to this ideal, never perfect, of course that's impossible, but of course you can be more or less towards some ideal.
Thank you, Anette. If there's no further feedback, I will go with my last question.
I think it's Klaus again, sorry.
Yeah, I don't see the hand, sorry.
Well, you don't look to the small Austrian in the picture. No, I just wanted to give a small little remark on the question: who is contributing to society? Who is donating or contributing public value content? Of course, it is possible that commercial media and commercial companies contribute to society. That's a given. But I think the trap here is simply the request for public money that is considered to be top slicing. So the argument of the commercial groups are saying, okay, if we deliver some sort of public value, you have to give us public money for that. So just slice up the license fee for public service media, and everyone can have a request, and everybody can participate on that. And this would be the end of public service media as we know it. Yeah. And this would mean that we would give public money to companies who actually make money for their shareholders. And I think this is a very big trap. We have to be sure that public money is spent for organizations who are controlled publicly, yeah, and who are owned publicly. Yeah, I think this is absolutely crucial. Infrastructure and ownership is crucial. Okay, there's no bad thing about give money for improving investigative journalism or quality journalism to commercial newspapers. That's absolutely okay. One should do that. Every single European country is doing that. But what the commercial companies are doing with the top slicing argument is they're grabbing public funding. Yeah. And I don't want to live in a world where we would give Austrian public money to Disney because Disney has paid a wonderful investigative documentary. And they certainly will, you know that. I mean, Netflix is I think, considering to spend 500 million euros, I think in Germany alone, yeah, if I have read that correctly. And of course they will deliver quality feature films. Yeah, of course they will, and fiction films. Of course they will. This will be best quality. Yeah, but that does not mean that we have to spend public money on Netflix. So I think this is just to add to the argument who would contribute with so-called public value. So I consider public value as an infrastructure for democracy in the way Karen has explained it, a contribution towards citizenship and not to business models. Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus, for this very interesting feedback. So now that I do not see any other hands, my last question, which is a bit selfish maybe, because that's something that I was told once. I was in a PhD seminar. We were presenting our PhD projects, and a professor told me that we should not confuse public service research with public service advocacy. And that's something that resonated with something you include in the introduction of your book. So I'd like to ask you, what's our role as researchers? Should we go into the advocacy field? What should our role be? What should we behave? Should we propose solutions? Should we wait for policymakers to ask for those solutions? How active should we be?
I have a clear opinion about that, in the sense that I always tell my PhD students, and I still have several ones that I supervise, why write a complete PhD if at the end you're not sharing some of your own ideas on the basis of that research with the academic community, but also with practitioners and policy? You know, that's like finishing an entire menu at a restaurant without a dessert. It feels a bit disappointing in a way. And what I am very cautious about, if the advocacy gets in the way of the research. So I always say, first research and then the conclusions and the recommendations. And sometimes you feel that the advocacy gets in the way of that. And I think that that is one of the main comments that I wanted to make in the book. Let's first do the research and then the second step. And that is also one of the main, and at first I felt a bit kind of reluctant to do this, and because I'm not Polish, I did a lot of research on the Polish situation. I spent quite some time there. I talked to a lot of people. And I think 2 or 3 years ago, before the COVID-19 pandemic hit us, I was invited in Warsaw to give a keynote at a communication sciences conference of all Polish communication and media scholars. So a lot of people in the audience. And I felt a bit of reluctant to share with them the conclusions of my research, which is basically, it does not work and it's very unlikely that it will ever work. So perhaps you should think about another system. And I felt a bit reluctant to do that. And I did. And actually, I think 99% of the room completely agreed with me. Why? Because it was built on solid research. It was not me like, you know, saying something intuitively. It was based on solid research, this recommendation. And I actually have to say that the few people that did not agree with it were people from UNESCO, because they're so keen on exporting the public service media model to each and every country on the planet. And it's perhaps their job, but I'm telling you, in some countries, it will never work. You need to completely rethink the model and perhaps rebuild it in another organization that is entrusted with it to date. So yes, I believe in recommendations. I think my book is full with it, but I think the research comes first, and otherwise that gets very, very cloudy. So I do not agree with the person in that webinar that says no. I think actually is also a responsibility that we as academics have to society. I mean, we're paid with taxpayers' money. I think at some point we also need to give back to the taxpayer to make the world, this sounds very pathetic, but to make the world a bit more of a better place. So, but you need to separate the two. And I sometimes feel that we're not doing that. And then it's when it becomes dangerous, because then it becomes more of an ideology, something political, then it becomes science and research based.
Thank you, Karen. Special thanks for that dessert metaphor. I will use in case I have this same discussion in the future. If our commentators, Hilde, Anette, and Klaus, want to add on this before we move to the audience questions.
I think I share Karen's view that activism, there's also degrees of activism, right? I mean, it's not necessarily even activism, but maybe just our duty, particularly in European countries where a lot of research is actually paid by the taxpayer, right? That we would at least share the results of our research. So it's even, so there's different ways in which we should, as academics, sort of, you know, speak out about the result, the outcome of our research. I think, like Karen, I think our research comes sort of first in terms of being, being the best potential research you could do with the best methods, etc. And then it can go from just sharing your ideas and maybe suggesting to activism, which can be a very much next step, very more aggressive step, if you like. So I think that, and that is some. That has to do with personal conviction, also with sort of, maybe your personality even. But the good research needs to come first. As Karen says, there's no point, if you really want people to listen to you, you have to come with decent data and decent analyses, I think. So in that sense, yeah, I think I support what Karen said.
Thank you, Hilde. Klaus and Anette. The Austrian guy on the corner, please. I saw the hand now.
Okay, just one sentence. I'm not finished with thinking about advocacy and things like that. We had a debate on the climate crisis, and if activism is needed or professional journalism, or is this a contradiction or not? If journalists should actually move into that space in saving the planet or civilization or not? Yeah. So this is a complicated issue. But as far as I can see, because I've been working at university as well, so in my understanding, there's no such thing than neutrality of science. So that on the contrary, I think scientific research includes to criticize procedures who don't work. Yeah, that makes progress in research possible. Yeah, so therefore I think it's not the job of academics to include themselves into an advocacy strategy of PSM. I do not expect that. Yeah, as working for public service media. On the contrary, I know that your credibility sometimes is much higher than my own arguments. And when I came up and, with the best data, they would say, Mr. Unterberger, I know you are only protecting your golden hotel above there, yeah, at Königelberg, yeah, but I don't believe you. Instead, at the same time, they would believe, the scientific data. So this is your safe haven, so to say, but this does not exclude that you as a researcher would step in when you think it's time to criticize procedures who work or do not work. Yeah, and the more you deal with issues like the common good and how it is created, I think the better it is. And we have seen, centuries now, not centuries, but a dozen of years, yeah, where science went back a little bit from the civil discourse, yeah, and so therefore I appreciate that researchers are entering that public and civic place again, because you are important for society as a vivid entity of vivid thinking and progressive thinking. This is what I appreciate, and there's a lot to criticize in our world and on our planet, and I think you should be included into that framework.
Thank you, Klaus. Anette, you wanted to add something as well.
Yes, I agree with all these what has been said about this research base, and then about the non-neutrality. I mean, subjective objectivity at best, or something like that. But also with regard to law, as regards my or with regard to the picture I had based on Karen's book, of course you can then suggest legal reforms or analyze existing law against some particular background or theory or framework, make interpretations and recommendations based on that theory or background, and so on. So against some ideal or some theoretical framework you choose to have. So it's also about choices again.
Thank you, Anette. I will give the floor now to Mina to continue moderating the Q&A that we have going on Zoom. Still have time to ask your questions, so Mina, go ahead.
Thank you to Karen. Thank you to commentators. You started a wonderful conversation, and because of the questions that we have received and the comments and quite frankly, my personal interest, I love the fact that, Karen, you have brought about the sort of contextual necessity if we start to talk about public broadcasters. And I will invite my colleague, Irina Grigor, to present a couple of questions from the Q&A. But just to start with, in your book, in the page 291, your chart, public media as citizenship and as democracy-centric project. You talk about goals, means, and necessary conditions. If we start to contextualize public service, right, and we think it as relative to conditions, what is then public service media? What are the qualifications of public service media when it's not the BBC model, it's not the Polish model? What are the minimal requirements for public service media? If we think about, for instance, we have one question about South Africa. There are more general questions about public service outside of the Western European context. So to you, Karen, and to all the panelists, what are those minimum requirements? Are they listed in your graph as accountability, professionalism, adaptivity, independence, and adequate funding? Are those the minimum requirements, or what could they be?
It's actually an excellent question that I conveniently don't answer in the book, and because in a way you refer to this visual means, goals, ultimate goal, and then the necessary conditions: accountability, professionalism, adaptivity, adequate funding, independence, trust. Also, I think is very important. But of course, there is never a situation of complete accountability. So if you go from 0 to 100%. How much is sufficient to be able to speak of a real public broadcasting system? I honestly don't have the answer to that. So the schedule actually presents, let's say, still the ideal, and then the empirical research actually needs to give some sort of flavor. And with Flanders, it's not perfect, but obviously I would argue it is a public service media system that meets the threshold, although not at 100%. And sometimes getting there and sometimes falling short. Poland, I would say, on a lot of these criteria, I mean, if it would be a student, would not pass the exam. But I think to get that really right, and of course, that's perhaps a bit of arrogant, because I do not want to say that my model is the correct model. But what would be nice, and before I actually decided to go to VRT, that was my dream as a next academic project, to ask people from various countries to actually apply this model to their public broadcasting system, to see if we could come to some sort of qualitative metric, because I don't really believe that you can quantify this. But yeah, then I became part of the management of VRT, and I abandoned that dream. But I still think that could be an interesting exercise, purely empirically, but also theoretically, because I'm sure that if 20-30 people from various countries would do that, that this would also result in an improvement of the model, because the model is obviously not perfect, and there could be modified and adapted, and people could come back with it and say, I found a very important condition that is not being met. And in the work I did with Michael Glowacki, we actually also said, and it's something we wanted to explore further, that a necessary condition for public service media to exist in reality was also the kind of almost sociological, psychological condition with citizens within society. Because what we observed with Polish citizens is, although several of them, of course, protest against what is going on, that a lot of them also don't, we talked about expectations, don't have the expectation of their public service media system, that it is a public service media system. So we said that, we also thought that that was a very important aspect, which is now not in the model, but it could actually prove to be an important necessary condition for public service media to exist. Can this model exist when people do not expect from it that it's there and that it fulfills, I mean, people, statistically relevant majority of the population? So you see that when I continued research after the book, the manuscript was already finished, I was already, together with colleagues, actually modifying the model. And in that sense, although I don't want to overstate the importance of my work, definitely not, I do hope that some people want to take up that challenge I'm always keen on collaborating with that, but that some people would say, okay, let's test this in 30, 40 countries around the world, come together in a webinar or in a pre-conference in a physical location and discuss this.
Wonderful, Karen. Let's take up on that and create a pre-conference for IMCR or some. Hilde, real quick, and then we have 5 open questions.
Yeah, I just want, and I think what I wanted to add to that maybe, which also goes back to some, because I think several of the Q&A that I've seen relate to sort of the global south, right? And I think it's very important to think maybe about, we talk very much, mainly the majority, the bulk of the research on public service media is very sort of from the West, right? It's very, and even Europe. And I think a key question is, it's very much part of there, it's very much part of contributing to democracy and whatever, but you also, I think we need to also be realistic about what can we expect of a public service broadcaster in a wider political context that is not, that sort of, you know, it's really, PSM is really made to fit that sort of West European even democratic model. Even in the US, it's kind of a different kind of politics even, or political system. So I think we have to be careful to sort of overestimate or have too many ideas about how, if you would only have public service media, how are you going to have them in context? So I think in that sense, we need to really, and that takes it to the broader, maybe political context, but they are very much related. And it would be maybe an unrealistic expectation to think that public service media, if we could create them in any and whatever political or social context, will by definition create the democratic ideal.
Yeah, if I can just briefly jump in on that, I completely agree with Hilde there, because also the EBU regularly publishes this research on how public broadcasting actually strengthens democracy. And you will not hear me say that that is not the case, of course. But I think it's more complex than that. Also, democracy nurtures public service media. There is a very intricate, like, mutual relationship there. So if you have a public broadcasting system, like in Poland, but also in a lot of countries in the global south, not all of them, but where there is not the experience of democracy, then this nurturing relationship towards public broadcasting is actually absent. And then you need to think on, does that make the model collapse? Or do you need to find kind of different contextual factors, that might actually install this kind of nurturing relationship that is needed? So we should not be too arrogant to think our public broadcasters will solve everything. You plant them somewhere and they will solve the democratic problem. It is very intricate relationship. So if you don't have this nurturing environment from the political and the legal context, then you need to replace it by something, I don't know what, because I'm not a researcher that goes into the global south, but you need something else that makes up for it, because otherwise it's a mission impossible, it's failure waiting to happen.
Thank you. Irina, the floor is yours for Q&A.
I'm very happy to continue the conversation with reading aloud the questions. And I start with the very first. It's from Amdam Hossan. And he asks, can the government-owned and managed public service broadcasters, so-called, be transformed into public service media?
I was really happy when I saw that question, because actually one of the questions that I answered myself after spending a lot of time on researching the Polish situation. And because at some point we had the impression the situation was improving in Poland, and then it went down again. But honestly, you cannot decide on that question on the basis of 1 or 2 or 3 cases. My idea is that it's extremely difficult to root out that almost institutionalized subservience to political and economic elites in an organization that has a history of decades of being essentially that. So it's not a yes or no answer, but I think it's extremely, extremely complicated to do that, because people working in there, some of them want to, but some of them were actually quite safe and secure in that environment. So very difficult. I don't know what the other people think about that. I'm not saying it's a mission impossible, but I do think it's extremely, extremely, extremely difficult, especially when that transition should happen in a context where you see an illiberal turn in politics, and where you see a return to authoritarian or semi-authoritarian policy making.
Thank you, Karen. We have 2 questions from Abderrahim Chalfawat. I'm sorry if I pronounce it wrong. So the first question is, at certain point, PSB, then PSM, were presented as alternative media to official ones, such as the case of BBC. Now, with the change of media scenarios due to digitalization, deep mediatization, and the potential of media capture, can we still present PSM as a serious alternative to official ones in media scenarios that lack PSM, such as in some countries in the global south? Or possibly there is need for an alternative theoretical framework that fits for the global south?
I think it's a bit the discussion that we had earlier also with Hilde's intervention, in the sense that I at least think that also scholars from the global south, they should look at the model in my book and completely destroy it. I mean, that's also scientific research. It's interaction, it's dialogue, and I don't know if it's really necessary to have a completely different theoretical model, but at least I know that the model that we have today is not sufficient. It's not adequate to capture. I also don't know if we can talk about the global south and the West, because if you only look at Europe, then you already see that the model is dysfunctional. So I think it's even more complex than that, and there is no kind of one-size-fits-all model to it. And the only thing that we can do to progress on that is to discuss it further and to try to build further, not per se on what I'm doing in the book, which also, by the way, it's not my model. It's the citizenship stuff, obviously inspired by a lot of other people in the field, not in the least also by work that Hilde has done. So you see, it's kind of building on work of others, criticizing some points, adding other points, removing some things. And I think we need to continue to do that, but also not by artificially dividing the West and the global South, because I also think that that is not exactly capturing what is going on, because also in the global South, we see that some countries are moving at a faster pace towards democracy, and others, actually, you see this illiberal turn. You also see, if I may say so, in countries like my own, you actually also see revivification of political capture of media. You see a lot of politicians actually threatening, criticizing journalists on social media, which results in self-censorship. So I also think we in the West should also kind of descend from our throne in the sky and admit that we also see illiberal turns in our own society. I think that Abderrahim asks a very valid question, and we will only be able to answer that question progressively together, but without simplistic kind of assumptions that sometimes I, as a Western scholar, have about the global South, and vice versa. We should at least avoid mythification of certain models. That is what we should not do.
I think Hilde also wants to comment on this question. Please, Hilde.
Yeah, just very briefly, sort of probably confirming, I think one, it's that idea that there is, the global South, which then suggests that it's almost homogeneous, which it is not. And also that, again, sets it sort of apart from then another part that, which is also not very homogeneous. I also think that while the way we try to learn from each other and the way we keep saying we should, European countries say we shouldn't only look at the BBC, I think in the same sense, whatever country or region that feels part of the global South should just not think that the European ideal is the ideal, because maybe it, because it is so part one, because it is really very much determined by a particular context. And so I think they should take from it, and any country probably should take from the ideals what they feel are sort of, really crucial, and then look maybe at various structures within which they have been organized. But I don't think that, if you would look more like the BBC tomorrow, that you would by definition have a better system for what particular country you are in. I think I also agree with what Karen says, that even if you look in Western countries, I'm currently in the US, that has had, I'm going to be very critical here for a moment, but that has, been sort of presenting itself for a very long time as a champion of democracy and, spread the message across the globe. If you look at many current trends in the US that are just moving away from that idea of democracy, or that even moving away in some parts of this country about what they think that the importance of voting, or how everybody should be, able to vote. I'm not sure whether, I think there is a return overall. So I think there's even a concern beyond what we would call roughly, but I'm not very happy with the term, the global south, about sort of a return. And maybe Poland is more an alarm bell than an oddity that we worry, because I do think that across we can see that aspects of democracy are maybe no longer taken for granted the way they were 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Thank you, Hilde. And the comment from Anette.
Yes, thank you. I was just thinking that the book, of course, is open to the idea or the possibility that the Western model is not fit for all. It is open to the possibility that the centralized institutions as they exist can or is not the only way to go. The book is open in those regards. But as I discuss the law part, and especially my national law, and then of course EU law, so I also am not in any way a researcher of the elsewhere, so to say. But of course, there can be so-called transplants of legal solutions and legal text elsewhere from the European Union, modeling them of sorts, or the labels might be similar, but then how they become in totally different political, societal, cultural environments is of course another thing. What the letter becomes in reality, the book becomes action and practice and so on. And then again, some sort of functional equivalent, so to say, may exist in different names under different labels. So.
Thank you, Anette. We have the question from Abderrahim for Klaus. So the question is interesting problematization of the concept of the public and in the public sphere. Then what are we to depend on to define and decide on what is public? Probably the common good, universality, openness, inclusiveness, agreement after rational critical debate. Would that be enough? Klaus?
I'm not sure if I have understood the question correctly, but maybe you can explain.
I can read it again, and you also can read it in question and answer box, but I will read it loud again. Interesting problematization of the concept of the public in the public sphere. Then what are we to depend on to define and decide on what is public? Probably the common good, universality, openness, inclusiveness, agreement after rational critical debate. Would that be enough?
That would give a good answer, I suppose. Yeah, basically, it's not up to me to define exclusively what the public would be, but it is some effect of a democratic system delivering public discourse, and then therefore public service media is a very useful tool for contributing to the public sphere. So generally speaking, public service media is like democracy. It is simply dead if you don't use it. Yeah. So this was basically the recipe of Mr. Orban. He found public service media quite useful. So he took it and used it. In my way, he misused it. Yeah. But I think the question we are referring to is, do we as a society use public service media, and do we want to change it? We should not forget, because we are always, Karen and me, you know, from small little countries, we are always like beggars and saying we don't have enough money and we need more money and stuff like that. I can't even hear that anymore, because public service media is a multi-billion enterprise, yeah, in Europe. So we are still powerful, even though we are like David versus Goliath. Yeah, this is the title of my recent public value report I've just published. But nevertheless, we are powerful infrastructure. But we have to be big in order to be powerful. Let me just explain you a very last small little story, yeah, if I'm allowed to do so, just 1.5 minutes. I've been to Hungary for producing a part of my last documentary, which was about how democracy actually can work. And I met a young journalist. And the situation for journalists in Hungary is desperate, is absolutely desperate, because there is no public service media in worthwhile called it public service. Yeah, you know all that. And this young journalist, Marton Gulyasi is his name. He is doing his own work. He's got his own, we would say, TV studio, inviting guests and delivering a vivid public debate, exactly what public service media should do, connected with citizens. And I think the work of Marton Gulyasi would fulfill the criteria of Karen's citizenship concept. Yeah. But you know, the fact is, he's putting his show on YouTube and he's collecting a couple of thousand viewers. Yeah, but that's not enough to be relevant. In the same time, in the split second, you know, the governmental, the state media is reaching out for the masses. So therefore, the crucial question is whether we take that instrument called public service media and transform it along the needs of, let's put it call it citizenship or democracy. But that's, I think, the big chance for the future. But sorry, that was a little bit expanded answer to the question your colleague has posed.
Thank you very much, Klaus. And now Minna will probably ask the final question to sum up this extremely interesting webinar.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to combine two questions. For the last question, we're going a couple of minutes past, but I think this is important because Dimitri and Robert Makato, both speaking from the perspective of South Africa, kind of go to a little bit more practical issues that are still fundamental, and that has to do with funding. And how funding, of course, can also be used in media capture, depending on how it is used. Can we actually, what kind of combinations could we even think about funding to sort of consider public media independent? And what policies related to funding or other policies are needed for public media to survive in current environment? And I think several of these issues have been addressed already, but what is sort of the minimal requirement and what would be the best possible model in the current environment for funding for public service media?
Yes, I mean, it's funding. It's a terribly complex thing in the sense that the public broadcaster I'm working for now has a mixed model, and so we get subsidies from government, and we also rely quite heavily, so for 40% of our budget on commercial revenues. That is advertising, but it's also program sales, that is distribution fees that we get, so that's quite diverse. That obviously makes that we have a lot of discussions with our commercial competitors about market distortion. which I kind of disagree with, but in any case, that creates quite a lot of tension. We also get state subsidies, which, as I said, have been reduced year and years in a row, which I also get because governments need to cut money also. I personally am in favor of a mixed model, but I prefer a license fee model being mixed with some level of commercial revenues. I'm not saying it should be 40%, but some commercial revenues also make, in my opinion, that public broadcasters also need to innovate, that they remain a bit on their toes, a bit edgy. It keeps them in check with reality. So I don't think that's a bad idea. But if I would be able to decide, I would prefer a license fee model over a subsidy model. I think research also shows that these models are more stable in terms of funding. I also think they ensure that public broadcasters are more accountable to audiences and not per se accountable in first place to politicians, which is also good, but I think they should be accountable first and foremost to audiences. So I do prefer mixed models. I know that some people also advocate for crowdfunding kind of based models, or let's say a bit the mecenat, rich people paying money, like I think which is the case also in the US, and so that you kind of out of charity or kind of a idea to improve society, you contribute to public broadcasting. I personally am not so favor of those kind of models, because I think they require a lot of investment for the money that you get out of it. So I know that sounds a bit unpopular to say so, but I do think that's also a practical reality of these things. But I am in favor of a mixed funding model. But like, if I could decide, I also tell each and every new minister of media in Flanders that I think they should start again with a license fee system, but to date, nobody has followed me. So that also testifies, I think, for limited impact.
I think, Karen, you will have to wait a little while on that. Yeah, but you have a lot of career left, as Klaus said. Hilde, real quick before we wrap up.
Yeah, sorry, just really quickly, I didn't want to, but I think because Karen mentioned it also, I think always your institution will be influenced by whoever or whatever pays for it. There is no way that you can find a way of funding it that will not affect the way that, you know, that it works, unless the public broadcaster itself wins the lottery and goes do whatever it wants, it will always be affected by it. If you look at, I think if you look at the US model, because as Karen says, there only 14% of its revenue is sort of the government funding, and then they have all kinds of different funding, slightly from their own sort of programming, but a lot of donations, as Karen also mentioned. So there is so in a sense, you could say there's so many complementary sources of funding that none can have a dominant influence. At the same time, you also see that it's in a very weak position. Again, it's because of the wider context. And I think that goes for the funding too. One, I think the funding will always sort of determine the options that you have. And so you could say the more diverse your funding, theoretically, the less impact of one type of funding. But the reality is just that unless you have one very strong committed set of funding, it's going to be very hard to organize whatever that is in any way meaningful and impactful on a wide enough scale.
Thank you, Hilde. Klaus, last but not least, your final remarks.
Yeah, my final remark to funding. I think public service media is not one media enterprise like any other. Public service media is a public infrastructure. So therefore, sustainable funding is crucial. So the health system would not work if it would depend on donations. Yeah. So I think this is a systematic question. If we want an infrastructure that is publicly owned, publicly controlled, yeah, and evaluated, yeah, including scientific research, and then it has to have a sustainable funding. And as Karen explained, there are many ways, and I agree once more to the public value director, that I would prefer a license fee model, but things are changing. The only thing is, if it goes to state budget, the independency to the state, to governments is obvious. So you have to take care in this way, because this is exactly what Mr. Orban did, because he actually raised the subsidies for public service media. However, he misused it for its own purpose. So it's again complicated.
Thank you, Klaus, and thank you for bringing up the S word, sustainability. I think, Karen, your work and providing us the model and bringing together theory, practice, and law and governance in one book is also something that I've been worried about, which is the sustainability of our field and our rethinking of public service media, and really taking it seriously as researchers, as advocates, as proponents. There are many forces, as Marius Dragomir's last report on state media, 155 countries, and he notes that the public service media that we've been talking about today is an anomaly in the world. But the kind of thinking and the model that you bring, Karen, brings me hope that we can really rethink this, and as our webinar has shown, there is so much interest in this in Europe and elsewhere. And this webinar also has exemplified to me what the IAPMR wants to do, the International Association of Public Media Researchers. We want to bring in new voices, we want to build bridges, both geographically and between different disciplines and between research and practice. So thank you, Karen, my warmest thanks and kudos and congratulations to your work. Thank you, our esteemed panelists, Anette, Alen-Savikko, Hilde van den Bulck, and Klaus Unterberger, for being advocates for this kind of work and research and discussions. Thank you for our participants. I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.
Karen, see you next time in Vienna. Okay, we'll work on that. We'll work on that. As Billy Joel is singing, Vienna waits for you. Yeah, we have to work on that. Yeah, okay. Bye-bye.